Same page here. It includes the urinary system, the urinary chart here of the nephron, body fluid regulation, hormone effects, the thirst response, normal and abnormal urine components, the ADH response and the aldosterone response, intercellular and extracellular fluid, ion concentrations, fluid consumption and elimination, and what we just covered, acid base. So it's through 25, is it? Is that on yours? 25?
24.
24, okay. So that's what you need to study for your test, and let me give you a few of the things in the textbook here. On page 961 is an illustration of the components of the urinary system: the kidneys, the ureters, the bladder, and the urethra. On page 963 is a cross-section of the kidney. On page 965 is an illustration of the nephron, including the renal corpuscle and the various parts of the tubule. 965, figure 25.5. And again, in the renal corpuscle, the only thing that happens is filtration, separating the plasma from the cellular components of the blood. And then in the tubule, you have reabsorption and secretion.
And on the tubule, you are including the proximal and the distal, right, altogether?
The proximal, the loop of Henle, the distal, and the collecting ducts. That's the tubule. Everything but the nephron. I mean, everything but the glomerular capsule. Don't get buried in all the transport mechanisms that are there, because there's a ton of them, and they only talk about a few of them. On page 977, table 25.1, there is a summary of each tubular component and what goes on. So it talks about the proximal, the loop of Henle, the distal, and the collecting ducts on that page, which is very similar to what's on your diagram, on your outline. The loop of Henle on page 980, showing the reabsorption of water in the descending limb, reabsorption of sodium and chloride, and as well as potassium in the ascending limb. And it goes into long discussions as to why all that happens. But you could spend an entire semester just on the tubular chemistry and only scratch the surface. The term micturition, I never have heard anyone use in the general public or in a physician's office. Nobody's told me to micture it, you know. Where you tell me to go urinate, you know. So I don't know who uses it. So that's just a term for the sake of a term, I guess. I don't know. Has anybody heard it being used?
Just in medical terminology.
Yeah, you learn it, but who is going to? It's a waste, you know. Learn something that has some value. What's a urologist? A urinary tract specialist, yeah. Okay, chapter 26, fluid electrolyte, acid base. On page 996, figure 26.1, it illustrates the fact that there's a lot more fluid inside cells than outside, intracellular fluid versus extracellular fluid. And on page 997, it illustrates which ions are extracellular and which ions are intracellular. The red bars are extracellular, and the yellow and blue bars are intracellular. And again, extracellular, we've got sodium chloride and bicarbonate. In intracellular, we got potassium, hydrogen phosphate, and magnesium. Major sources of water intake and output on page 999, figure 26.4. The thirst response, in a lot more detail on 999, but what you need to know is in your outline. Then there's the ADH response on 1000 and the aldosterone response on 1004. Acid base buffer systems 1008 and 9. Make sure that you answer a question as it's asked. In other words, if I say, describe a buffer, or define a buffer and explain how it works, I'm not asking you to pick one of these buffer systems, because there's buffers everywhere outside the body as well. You know, when you're using a pH meter, you put it in buffer when you're not using it. You know, there's all kinds of buffers. So a buffer is anything that maintains a constant pH by neutralizing acids and bases. And you can have a buffer at pH 10, you can have a buffer at pH 1, you can have a buffer anywhere in the pH scale. It's just that the blood chemistry buffer happens to be at 7.4 because that's what we're trying to maintain.
Can you repeat that definition, please? Anything that
Is able to neutralize an acid and a base. Then it goes into the buffering mechanisms, the bicarbonate buffering system on 1009, phosphate on 1010, and protein on 1010. Respiratory physiology on 1010, and the renal mechanisms, renal physiology on 1011. On page 1016, table 26.2, there are actually 4 types of pH issues in your body. 2 of them are metabolic, and 2 of them are respiratory. The metabolic ones are relatively rare, and due to things like renal disease and starvation and using too many diuretics and things like that. So I'm not too crazy about spending a lot of time on those. But the most significant one, again, is respiratory acidosis, and that's impaired lung function, so that CO2 isn't gotten rid of. I guess a narcotic and barbiturate overdose can do it as well. Respiratory alkalosis, like I said, is quite rare also, and due to unusual circumstances. So the only one of those four that's really the big culprit is the respiratory acidosis one. And that's that.